They don't always remember his name, but they remember the story, and that's how legends live forever, not in history books, but in the hearts of those who still carry the fire. In 1989, while digitizing old Navy archives, a young historian named Mark Danton stumbled upon a folder labeled Experimental Fire Control, 1943, Restricted. Inside were brittle diagrams signed TE. He began digging and soon realized what he'd found. His research led to interviews with surviving sailors from the USS Bellowwood, who confirmed the legend. A civilian firefighter, a forbidden experiment, a miracle that saved them all. Mark published his findings in a paper titled The Forgotten Fireman. It spread through military academies and naval museums like wildfire. By the 1990s, the Navy could no longer ignore it. They issued a quiet correction to their historical records. The original concept for naval foam suppression systems was developed with critical input from civilian engineer Thomas Elroy. It wasn't front-page news, but for those who knew, it was enough. History had finally caught up with truth. Legacy of the Flame. Today, every carrier in the U.S. Navy, every ship that sails under stars and stripes, carries a piece of Thomas Elroy's invention. His foam still floods the decks in drills. His principles still guide firefighting schools around the world. But perhaps his greatest legacy isn't chemical. It's moral. Because his story isn't just about machines or formulas. It's about defiance. About a man who refused to let bureaucracy smother courage. A man who saw fire and didn't back away. Who built something that saved others, even when it cost him everything. Epilogue. Every year, on the anniversary of the USS Forrestal fire, sailors gather for a small remembrance ceremony. They read the names of the fallen. They pour a thin line of foam along the deck. Just a symbol, a ritual. And when it's done, someone always says the same words. To the man who taught us to fight back. Names fade. Ideas don't. That's enough. She wrote her article anyway. It ran in Life magazine under the title, The Man Who Taught Steel to Breathe. The piece went viral as anything could in 1967. Fire academies began quoting his words. Naval historians started asking questions. And though the Navy still didn't issue an official statement, behind closed doors, some began to quietly acknowledge the truth. The final voyage. In 1970, Thomas Elroy was invited to speak at a naval safety symposium in Norfolk, Virginia. He almost declined. But something in him, perhaps the same defiance that had once ignored orders and built his forbidden system, made him accept. He walked to the podium, gray-haired and stooped, his voice quiet but steady. He didn't read from notes. He didn't bring blueprints. He just spoke from the heart. We fought fire not with fear but with reason. We built not because we were told to, but because we believed every man's life was worth saving. If that spirit dies, then no technology can save us. When he finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, officers and engineers rose to their feet. No applause at first, just quiet respect. And then, finally, a standing ovation. A few days later, a young ensign approached him with tears in his eyes. He handed Elroy a small box wrapped in blue cloth. Inside was a simple brass plaque engraved with 6 words. To the fireman who never quit. Elroy kept it on his bedside table until the day he died. The oceans whisper. Thomas Elroy passed away in 1973 at the age of 61. He was buried overlooking the Pacific, the same ocean whose flames he'd once fought. His headstone bore no rank, no medal, no mention of the Navy. Just a single line. He taught ships to survive the fire. But the story didn't end there. Rediscovery. Handwritten notes from sailors asking, "Do you know who made the foam?" One of those letters found its way to Helen Carver, the reporter who'd once written about Elroy 20 years earlier. She was retired now, living in Oregon. But when she saw the headline about the Forrestal, she remembered. She still had her old notes, and she still had his address. She packed her car and drove through the night. The interview. When Helen knocked on his door, Thomas was in his garden, tending to a small patch of roses. He looked up, squinting at the sunlight, and said, Didn't think anyone still remembered that story. Helen smiled, holding up an envelope with the Navy's insignia. They do now. They talked for hours. About the fires, the fear, the silence. She told him about the Forrestal, about how hundreds of sailors had lived because of the system he created. For the first time, he looked truly at peace. He said softly, "Then maybe it was worth being forgotten." When Helen asked him if he wanted to go public again, to finally take credit, he shook his head. The fire returns. For years later, in 1967, tragedy struck again. The aircraft carrier USS Forrestal, the very ship whose launch Elroy had watched with pride, caught fire during a combat operation in the Gulf of Tonkin. It began with a rocket misfire, a single spark, and then hell broke loose. Bombs cooked off on deck. Jet fuel poured down into the hangars. Men screamed. Engines exploded. The sea turned black with smoke. It was the Navy's worst peacetime disaster. But this time, something was different. Within minutes, emergency teams flooded the deck with Elroy's foam system. Jets of white mist blanketed the flames, choking oxygen, cooling steel, saving hundreds of lives. If not for that foam, the entire carrier would have gone down with every man aboard. When the news reached the States, the nation mourned the dead, but few realized the quiet miracle behind the survival of the rest. In a small apartment near Long Beach, Thomas watched the footage on a flickering black and white TV. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just whispered to himself, "You still remember how to breathe." And then, for the first time in decades, he smiled. Recognition in silence. Months later, an official Navy report credited the AFFF system for saving the Forrestal from total destruction. The authors didn't know, or perhaps chose not to know, that the man who designed that system was still alive. But among the young sailors who had survived the inferno, word began to spread again. Stories of the firemen. The legend of a civilian who'd once tamed flame itself resurfaced. No one knew his name, but everyone felt his ghost on that deck. Letters began arriving at fire stations across California. Fire doesn't care about fame. It only respects what works. Those words became the unofficial motto of naval firefighting units for years. Most of them never knew where it came from. But if you stood close enough to the ocean at night, where the wind carries the memory of steel and flame, you could almost hear him say it again. And so, while the Navy tried to bury his story in files and secrecy, the truth refused to stay buried. Because truth, like fire, always finds air to breathe. The world had changed. The smoke had cleared. And the war that once consumed the earth now lived only in memories, and in the scars of the men who fought it. Thomas Elroy, the man the Navy once called a mechanic, then forgot, had grown old. His hair had gone white like the foam he'd once created. His hands, those same hands that once gripped fire hoses and wrenches in the belly of burning ships, now trembled when he reached for his morning coffee. But his mind, sharp as ever, still burned with one thought. The truth must outlive him. In 1963, Thomas sat at his old wooden desk, surrounded by rusted blueprints, faded notes, and yellowed photos of ships he'd saved. He took a pen, the same one he'd carried in his coveralls during the war, and began writing a letter. To whoever reads this, I am not asking for recognition. I am asking for remembrance. We built something that saved lives, not for medals, but because it was right. If one day you walk the deck of a ship and see foam covering the flames, remember that idea was born in desperation, in courage, and in fire. He signed it with just 2 words. The fireman. He never mailed it. He folded it carefully, slipped it between the pages of an old naval manual, and left it there, as if waiting for the sea itself to find it someday. You are invited to attend the launch of the USS Forrestal, first of her class of supercarriers. He hesitated, unsure if it was real or another cruel trick. But something in him, the same stubborn spark that had refused to die, told him to go. When he arrived at the ceremony, dressed in his old brown suit, no one recognized him. The speeches praised industry, leadership, progress. And then, during a safety demonstration, a naval officer explained how the Forrestal's new integrated fire suppression system worked, the very one Elroy had designed years earlier. He watched as jets of white foam cascaded across the deck, just like that day on the below wood. A small boy beside him clapped in excitement. Elroy smiled and whispered, "Looks like she learned to breathe again." The silent recognition. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, an old sailor approached him quietly. He looked at Elroy for a long moment, then said, "You're him, aren't you? The fireman." Elroy didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sailor saluted, tears in his eyes. "We never forgot, sir. None of us did." And then he walked away. Elroy stood there as the ship's horn echoed across the harbor. A sound that carried every memory, every flame, every life his invention had saved. He didn't need medals. He had something far rarer. He had been remembered by the men who mattered, a legacy written in smoke. In the decades that followed, Elroy's invention became standard worldwide. Every airport, refinery, and carrier deck used variations of his formula. He was never officially credited, never featured in textbooks. But every time a fire was stopped before it spread, a piece of his ghost lingered there, whispering through the foam. He once wrote in a letter to his student. He wouldn't say more. She published the story anyway. It appeared in the Los Angeles Daily Mirror under the headline, "The Man Who Fought Fire for Freedom." Within days, the Navy sent a letter to the paper calling it inaccurate and misleading. The story was buried under other headlines: the Korean War, the Red Scare, atomic tests in Nevada. No one paid attention. But in the quiet corners of the firefighting world, people took notice. Requests for information flooded in. Fire departments wanted blueprints. Factories wanted training. Airfields wanted installations. And slowly, the Navy realized they couldn't hide the truth forever. Declassification. By 1951, with the Cold War heating up, the Navy finally declassified the system, renaming it AFFF, Aqueous Film Forming Foam. They didn't mention Elroy. They called it a collaborative wartime development. But in the engineering blueprints, buried deep in a line of technical references, one name appeared, initials only, T, Fire Control Consultant. That was all that remained of him. 2 letters in a forgotten file. But those 2 letters would outlive every medal, every speech, every admiral. Because while the Navy had tried to bury his name, they couldn't bury his legacy. The return to sea. In 1953, a letter arrived at Elroy's door. It bore the seal of the U.S. Navy. Inside, a single sentence. He hadn't invented it. He hadn't even believed in it at first. But now, as medals and promotions were being handed out, Pierce saw an opportunity. He submitted a report claiming inspiration from civilian contributions, but credited the final design to Navy engineers under his command. Congress accepted it without question. In 1949, Admiral Pierce was awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal for advancements in naval safety technology. And somewhere in Los Angeles, Thomas Elroy read the news. The name he'd fought to protect replaced by one that had tried to stop him. He didn't get angry. He just went to the ocean that night, stood by the pier, and watched the reflection of the waves burn orange under the setting sun. He whispered, "You can hide a name, but you can't hide the fire." The reporter. In 1950, a war correspondent named Helen Carver, who had covered the Pacific Front, started researching an article titled, "The Fires the Navy Feared." She'd heard whispers from sailors about a civilian firefighter who'd saved carriers with a mysterious foam. Everywhere she looked, the Navy denied it. But the sailors? They remembered. One of them, a retired chief named Bill Hanrahan, told her, "Ma'am, we called him Ash Hands. He didn't flinch at the flames. You can thank him that I'm still breathing." Carver traced Elroy to a small rental home near Long Beach. He was older now, thinner, his hands still scarred from burns decades old. When she asked him if he'd been the man behind the foam, he only said, "I built something that worked." Then the fire went quiet. Civilian technician Elroy may attempt to assert authorship over Navy flame suppression technology. Recommend containment. Containment, a word that said everything and nothing. Within weeks, Elroy's workshop was inspected by safety officials. His wartime records were seized. Blueprints disappeared. Even his former supervisor at the Los Angeles Naval Yard refused to take his calls. He was being erased. When he tried to publish an article in Popular Mechanics about the science behind oxygen displacement foam, the editor received a warning from the Navy's Office of Censorship. They said it contained restricted details. The piece was pulled before it went to print. For Thomas Elroy, the silence was deafening. He had saved hundreds of ships, and now couldn't even speak his own invention's name. A spark in the shadows. But Elroy wasn't done. In 1948, he began secretly teaching at a small fire academy outside San Diego. He told students stories about the war, the fires, and the lessons learned at sea. He never mentioned his name in the reports, never used the term naval foam. He just called it freedom's fire. He taught that no invention belongs to one man, it belongs to those it saves. One night, after a lecture, a young firefighter asked him, "Sir, did you ever see combat?" Elroy smiled softly and said, "Son, I fought something hotter than bullets." No one in that classroom knew they were learning from the man whose idea had saved an entire fleet. Behind closed doors. Meanwhile, inside Washington, a storm was brewing. The Navy's research division was being restructured under new leadership, and a man named Admiral Harlan Pierce, who'd commanded a carrier during the war, wanted recognition for supervising the development of the foam system. Ships that had once been war machines were now scrap metal. Factories turned from bombers to automobiles. And men like him, who'd built miracles, found themselves standing in unemployment lines. His fire suppression system, now renamed Naval Foam Type 7A, was classified. The military had quietly erased his name from the patents, transferring ownership to the Bureau of Ships. To them, Elroy wasn't a hero. He was a risk, a civilian who'd challenged command and been right. That didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. He tried writing letters. To the Navy, to Congress, to anyone who would listen. But the replies were all the same. "Thank you for your contribution to the war effort. Unfortunately, due to national security concerns, details of your work cannot be disclosed." National security, the phrase that buried more truths than any grave. The investigation. In 1947, a quiet memo circulated inside the Navy's engineering division. It was labeled "Confidential, Possible Civilian Claim on Fire Control IP." Inside was a single line, just a line of ink in a sea of forgotten heroes. But among the men who'd seen it, who'd lived it, his legend endured. They told stories of the day the ocean caught fire, and the firefighter who dared to tell the Navy they were fighting flames the wrong way. Legacy in foam and fire. Decades later, the technology he built would evolve into modern AFFF systems, used in airports, oil rigs, and every naval vessel on Earth. Even NASA adopted a derivative of his design to protect rocket launch pads. Everywhere something burned, there was a trace of Thomas Elroy's stubborn genius. And yet, his grave in Los Angeles bears only 4 words. He fought the fire. For the world, he was just another name lost to time. But for the sailors of the Pacific, he was the man who turned death itself into steam. When the war ended, the Pacific went silent. No more sirens. No more screaming engines overhead. Just the soft hum of waves against steel hulls, and the ghosts of men who never came home. But even in peace, the Navy was still fighting a different kind of war. One of credit, of control, and of silence. A forgotten hero. Thomas Elroy returned home in 1946 to a nation rebuilding itself. And Thomas Elroy? He vanished into a blur of war work, traveling from ship to ship, training crews, inspecting installations. He wasn't a commander. He wasn't a hero in uniform. But sailors began whispering his name anyway. The fireman, a whisper in the smoke. One night, on the deck of the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, Elroy watched as fire control drills ran like clockwork. Foam jets spraying, teams moving in precision. A lieutenant beside him asked quietly, "Sir, why do you always stand so close to the flames?" Elroy smiled, eyes distant. "Because that's where truth hides." Everyone talks about courage until the heat touches them. Then you see who they really are. That line would later be engraved on the Navy's Fire Control School plaque in his honor. But history doesn't honor quietly. When the war ended in August 1945, America celebrated pilots, generals, inventors, not firefighters. The system was kept classified until 1951. By then, Elroy had gone back to California, a forgotten man with burns on his hands and a story nobody asked to hear. The day the ocean remembered. It wasn't until years later, in 1955, that the truth surfaced. A declassified report from the Bureau of Ships revealed that Elroy's foam system had saved at least 312 ships from destruction between 1944 and 1945. Admirals called it the invisible shield of the Pacific. The press barely noticed. A small column in a local paper read, "Fire suppression method credited with reducing naval casualties." That was it. No name, no face. Ammunition cooked off in chain reactions. For a moment, even the captain thought the ship was lost. Then someone remembered the system. Within minutes, dozens of sailors activated the foam lines. Geysers of white mist erupted from the deck, coating the flames, sealing compartments. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Where ordinary hoses had once failed, Elroy's system fought back. The Bunker Hill survived. Barely, but she survived. Half her crew was dead or wounded, yet she stayed afloat long enough to save the rest. When the fires finally died, the captain ordered a message sent to Naval Command. Recommend immediate installation of Elroy firefighting system fleet-wide. Proven. Effective. Vital. That single transmission changed naval engineering overnight. A war of fire and steel. Back in California, Elroy received a telegram. Short, cold, official. Your design credited with saving Bunker Hill and below wood. Further production authorized. Congratulations. He didn't celebrate. He just sat on the steps of his workshop, staring at the sunset through smoke-stained hands. He knew what those few words meant. Men lived because he had refused to give up. But there was more to do. The Navy now faced a logistical nightmare: how to install foam systems on hundreds of ships before the next wave of kamikazes. Factories in Chicago, Detroit, and San Diego were converted overnight. Oil companies were asked to help produce foam concentrate in secret. The system was renamed Naval Fire Control Model 7, classified under wartime secrecy. No one outside the military was allowed to mention it. Smoke hung low, curling like ghosts over the charred metal. The sailors stared in disbelief. They had seen fires eat ships alive but never die that fast. The captain, speechless, simply whispered, "Whatever that was, just saved us." Fire on the horizon. Word spread fast. By nightfall, the other two carriers with Elroy's system, USS Bunker Hill and USS San Jacinto, had their crews trained and ready. They called it the White Tide, the miracle foam that turned death into steam. But war doesn't wait for miracles. 2 weeks later, during the Okinawa offensive, Japanese forces unleashed the largest kamikaze assault in history, over 1,500 planes diving toward the American fleet. The ocean turned into a war of flame and metal. Ship after ship was hit. And in the chaos, Elroy's invention was about to face its greatest test. The Bunker Hill Inferno. May 11, 1945. A clear morning. The Bunker Hill, one of the Navy's most powerful carriers, was launching aircraft when two kamikazes came in low, hugging the sea to avoid radar. They struck within 30 seconds of each other. Both carried full fuel tanks. Both hit the flight deck. The explosion ripped open the ship's core. A wave of fire rolled down the hangar, feeding on fuel, oxygen, and paint, turning the carrier into a 900-foot-long furnace. Men screamed. But for one man, it was just beginning. Thomas Elroy, the firefighter who'd spent years being ignored, was now on the deck of the USS Below Wood as a civilian advisor. His prototype system had been installed across 3 ships for field evaluation. He wasn't there to fight. He was there to watch, to see if his foam could hold against real hellfire. And then hell arrived. The first flame. It started with a sound. Not the whine of an engine, Not the roar of artillery, but something sharper. The scream of a kamikaze diving from the clouds. The below woods gunners opened fire, tracer rounds carving orange arcs through the sky. For a second, it seemed the plane would miss, then it struck the deck just aft of the island. The impact tore open the fuel lines, igniting thousands of gallons of aviation gas. Flames erupted instantly, a wall of orange swallowing everything in seconds. The ship's metal deck glowed, and men ran blinded by smoke and heat. The Pacific didn't just burn, it boiled. Elroy stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to grab a hose. But this wasn't a building in Los Angeles. This was a floating city of bombs. Every second counted. And then, amid the chaos, he saw it, his system's activation valve near the bulkhead. He sprinted through the inferno, shielding his face from heat waves so intense they melted his boots. He yanked the lever down and waited. For 3 eternal seconds, nothing. Then, with a hiss like the breath of a sleeping dragon, white foam burst from the nozzles across the deck. It poured over the fire, crawling across the steel, clinging to the walls, devouring oxygen itself. The roar of flames became a hiss. The light faded to gray, and when it was over, the deck was silent. But the recognition, that didn't come. Elroy wasn't a naval officer or an engineer from MIT. He was just a firefighter with an idea. His name didn't appear on any reports. No medals, no perats. Just a quiet thank you letter, and a return to his station in Los Angeles. Yet when the Battle of Okinawa came, and hundreds of kamikaze planes slammed into Allied ships, it was Elroy's system, his rejected idea, that kept the carriers afloat. Crews reported entire decks burning out, only to be saved by the foam. One sailor later said, "If not for that white blanket, we'd have joined the bottom of the Pacific." But that was only the beginning, because when the Navy realized what Elroy had built, they didn't just use it. They modified it, expanded it, and soon turned it into the world's first automated fire suppression system at sea. The man they once ignored had unknowingly changed naval engineering forever. And yet, the story of how it all happened, how one firefighter with no rank, no budget, and no permission saved hundreds of ships, was almost erased from history. The sun rose over the Philippine Sea like it always did, bright, merciless, and indifferent. Below that calm horizon, an armada moved east. Dozens of American carriers, cruisers, and destroyers slicing through the morning mist. It was March 1945, just weeks before the invasion of Okinawa. For many sailors, the war already felt won. He packed his notes, his blueprints, and even his small steel demo unit, and drove 300 miles to Naval Station San Diego. He wasn't invited. He wasn't cleared. But he walked straight to the commanding officer's tent and said, "Sir, your ships are burning because you're using the wrong weapons. Let me show you the right one." The captain, impressed by the man's fire, both literal and figurative, agreed to a 10-minute test. They set up a section of the deck with fuel drums and magnesium powder, a nightmare combination. When the fire was lit, the flames leapt 20 feet high, melting paint off nearby bulkheads. Elroy activated his system, and within seconds, a thick white foam rolled over the deck, smothering the blaze into silence. The officers stood speechless. No shouting, no water jets, no chaos, just calm, total control. That afternoon, Elroy's crazy invention was no longer a joke. It was the future. The Navy immediately ordered more tests. Within months, aqueous film-forming foam, AFFF systems, began appearing on every major vessel. They called it Project Guardian. And for the first time, American ships could survive the one thing that had haunted them since Pearl Harbor, fire. But Elroy didn't stop. He began experimenting using gasoline, diesel, salt water, and metal sheets, trying to simulate shipboard fires in his backyard. Neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. But every time the wind carried black smoke across the sky, he learned something new about how heat moved and how metal reacted. He built a crude model, a steel hull section with compartments, and began testing pressure-based foam systems instead of plain water. Water, he realized, was useless in oil fires. It spread the flames instead of killing them. Foam, on the other hand, could smother them. By early 1943, Elroy had a prototype, a system that mixed foam concentrate with seawater, pushed through by the ship's existing pumps. It could cover an entire deck in under 20 seconds. But again, when he presented the idea to the Navy's Bureau of Ships, the engineers laughed. A foam machine? You think we're going to fill our warships with soap bubbles? He was dismissed again. Months passed. The war moved deeper into the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. And with every battle came a familiar headline: carrier engulfed in flames after bomb hit. It was the one weakness the Japanese kept exploiting. They didn't need to sink the ships. They just had to set them on fire. Then, in 1944, the unthinkable happened. The USS Franklin, one of the Navy's proudest carriers, was struck by 2 bombs near Japan. Within minutes, fires tore through her hangar deck. Fuel tanks ignited, ammunition exploded, and over 800 men were killed. The Navy called it an unavoidable tragedy. Elroy called it proof. They said he didn't belong there. A firefighter among sailors. A man with a hose, in a world of guns, steel, and explosions. But when the Pacific turned into a floating inferno, his rejected idea would be the only thing standing between life and total annihilation. The year was 1942. Pearl Harbor was still a wound that refused to heal, and the U.S. Navy was rebuilding fast. New ships were rolling off the docks every month, bigger, stronger, faster. But there was one problem no admiral could fix: fire. When a ship was hit, not even sunk, just hit, it wasn't the explosion that killed her. It was the fire that followed. Jet fuel, ammunition, torpedoes, one spark and the whole deck became a death trap. Men weren't drowning. They were burning alive. And deep inside a small coastal town in California, a man named Thomas Elroy, a firefighter with soot in his lungs and stubbornness in his soul, watched the newsreels and whispered, "Those ships don't need more guns. They need firefighters." He'd seen what heat could do. He'd seen buildings collapse, tanks explode, men vanish under a wave of flame. But naval officers, they didn't think like that. To them, a ship was a fortress, not a tinderbox. And so when Elroy wrote to the Navy Department, proposing a new way to fight onboard fires, his letter was stamped, logged, and politely filed under rejected.